It is the 14th of March, 1943. Somewhere in the gray heave of the North Atlantic, a British escort destroyer is cutting through 12-ton swells at 22 knots. The convoy she is guarding 53 merchant vessels, carrying millions of tons of food, fuel, and war material, stretches 8 miles across the ocean behind her. Beneath the waves, the Germans have been tracking this convoy for 3 days. They know exactly where it is. Then, without warning, a ripple of explosions tears open the water 2 miles off the port bow. It is not a depth charge, not a torpedo. The sounds are different, sharp, concussive, intimate, rising from the surface rather than below it. On the bridge, the first lieutenant stares at his instruments. The ASDIC operator, a young man from Coventry who has never fired a weapon in his life, looks up with an expression that neither man can quite interpret. "Contact, sir," the operator says, or rather, what used to be a contact. By dawn the following morning, the same destroyer has made 3 more attacks. By the end of those 48 hours, 7 confirmed U-boat kills are recorded along the convoy's route. In Berlin, Admiral Karl Donitz, architect of Germany's Wolfpack strategy and one of the most analytically precise naval commanders of the war, reads the intelligence summaries and does something extraordinary for a man of his character. He writes in his personal log that the British appear to have found something that defies conventional explanation. His intelligence staff, in a separate assessment, use a phrase that would have seemed absurd in any other context: Hexerei, the German word for witchcraft. What had happened was not magic. It was a particular wire configured in a particular way, attached to a weapon that had been dismissed by nearly everyone who first heard about it. Its story is one of the most compressed acts of technical genius the Second World War produced, and it remains even now one of the least understood turning points in the Battle of the Atlantic. To understand why that wire mattered, you need to understand the scale of the crisis it was designed to answer. By the autumn of 1942, the United Kingdom was losing the war at sea. Not losing ground, not suffering setbacks, but losing in the truest sense of the word, with a finality that terrified the men who saw the full figures. In November of that year alone, Allied shipping losses reached 86,000 tons. 800,000 tons of supplies, food, oil, sunk in 30 days. Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. He was not being rhetorical. The problem was as geometrical as it was technological. A convoy traveling at 9 knots across an ocean roughly 3,000 miles wide was for most of its journey beyond the range of land-based air cover. This unprotected corridor, called the Black Pit or the Atlantic Gap, stretched for roughly 600 miles in the mid-Atlantic. Within it, German wolfpacks operated with near impunity, coordinating surface attacks at night when the U-boats were largely invisible to radar. The British had ASDIC, the underwater acoustic detection system, but ASDIC was useless against a surfaced submarine. It was equally useless against a submarine attacking from astern at periscope depth, because ASDIC had a dead zone directly beneath the attacking ship. The weapons available to convoy escorts made the dead zone worse. A ship traveling over a submerged U-boat at 14 knots needed several seconds to slow, turn, and reacquire. During those seconds, which could amount to 150 meters of ocean, the U-boat could maneuver. The standard depth charge, rolled off the stern or launched sideways by a thrower, was accurate only to within 30 or 40 meters in ideal conditions against a U-boat that had just received a firm warning to go deep. Those conditions rarely obtained. In the first years of the war, British anti-submarine vessels were expending an average of between 30 and 50 depth charges for every U-boat killed. At that rate of expenditure against the number of U-boat Donitz was deploying in 1942, arithmetic alone was against the Allies. What was needed, the men at the Admiralty's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division increasingly believed, was not more explosive. It was a weapon that could throw that explosive forward ahead of the ship into the Aztec contact without the vessel ever needing to cross directly over the submarine. A weapon that could kill a U-boat while Aztec was still holding it. The answer came from a facility in Dorset that most people have never heard of. The Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, popularly and semi-affectionately known within Whitehall as the Department of Mutton. From its initials, DMWD had been established specifically to pursue ideas that the conventional weapons establishments considered too speculative or too eccentric to be worth serious engineering effort. It was staffed characteristically for wartime British science by a mixture of professional engineers, physicists drafted from universities, and a handful of individuals whose qualifications were somewhat more difficult to categorize. One of the department's contributors was a former stage magician. Another held a doctorate in medieval history. This was considered normal. The weapon they developed was called the Hedgehog. Its name came from its appearance: a spigot mortar array mounted on the bow of an escort vessel. 24 individual projectiles arranged in an oval pattern, their spigots jutting upward and outward at slightly varying angles, so that when fired simultaneously, triggered by a single electrical circuit, they spread across a roughly 40-meter ellipse in the water ahead of the ship. Each projectile was roughly 40 centimeters in length and weighed approximately 14 kilograms. The warhead itself contained only about 1.5 kilograms of high explosive, which is, for context, considerably less than a standard depth charge. The critical difference was the fuse. Depth charges detonated by water pressure, set to explode at a given depth, regardless of whether they were anywhere near a submarine. The Hedgehog's projectiles used a contact fuse. They exploded only when they struck something solid, which meant that when a Hedgehog salvo produced an explosion, it had unambiguously hit its target. The mathematics of this distinction are worth dwelling on for a moment. A pattern of 24 projectiles spread across a 40-meter ellipse, fired at a U-boat, whose position is known within roughly that margin of error, had by 1943 calculations approximately a 1 in 4 chance of a direct hit on any given attack. A direct hit meant a kill. Depth charges, by contrast, had to detonate within about 4 meters of a pressure hull to guarantee lethal damage. Given the arc of a sinking depth charge and the U-boat's capacity for evasion during the Aztec dead zone, the kill probability per attack with depth charges was estimated at under 5%. The Hedgehog's probability per attack, once crews were trained, was somewhere between 20 and 25%. This was not an incremental improvement. It was a different order of magnitude. The wire that completed the system was the firing circuit. All 24 spigots were connected to a single electrical trigger, calibrated so that every projectile launched within a window of under 1/10 of a second, ensuring the spread pattern hit the water as close to simultaneously as possible. If the firing sequence staggered, if individual projectiles launched even a half-second apart, the oval pattern collapsed into a line. The coverage dropped catastrophically, and the statistical advantage that made the weapon lethal was lost. The wire, in other words, was not incidental to the design. It was the design. The simultaneous salvo was the entire point. Manufacturing the Hedgehog at scale presented its own challenges. The spigot mortar concept was not new. Variants had been used in land-based anti-tank roles, but adapting the geometry of the array so that 24 projectiles produced a consistent elliptical splash pattern required iterative testing at HMS Osprey, the Royal Navy's anti-submarine warfare school at Portland. Early trials in 1941 produced frustrating inconsistency. Wind affected the projectiles significantly, far more than expected, and the shape of the oval changed depending on the direction of fire relative to the ship's heading. A firing stabilizer was eventually fitted that partially corrected for roll, but the Hedgehog remained sensitive to weather conditions in ways that depth charge systems were not. Production was distributed across several facilities in the Midlands and the north of England, with final assembly and testing conducted at Portland before weapons were fitted to escort destroyers and corvettes. Precise production figures remain, in some cases, a matter of estimation, since records of individual component manufacture were kept by separate contractors. What is clear is that by the end of 1942, a substantial proportion of the Atlantic convoy escort fleet had been fitted with the system, and training exercises at Portland were being compressed from weeks to days as demand accelerated. Operationally, the Hedgehog was first deployed in action in January 1942 aboard HMS Westcott in the North Atlantic. The early results were, by the Navy's own assessment, disappointing. Not because the weapon failed to work, it functioned exactly as designed, but because crews were unwilling to use it. This is one of those human details that official histories tend to pass over quickly, but which, in retrospect, is essential to understanding the weapon's delayed impact. Depth charges produced enormous visible explosions. They threw up geysers of white water. They made the ocean shake. When a depth charge attack failed to produce a kill, the crew could still feel that something had happened. That enormous energy had been expended. A Hedgehog salvo that missed produced no explosion at all. Nothing. Silence. For experienced anti-submarine crews, who had been trained to equate visible violence with effective action, this was psychologically very difficult to accept. They kept reverting to depth charges. It took a deliberate program of instruction, and more importantly, the circulation of documented kill records from the small number of crews who had persisted with the new system to shift this psychology. The records, once they existed in sufficient number, were persuasive. By the spring of 1943, when the mid-Atlantic battles were at their most intense, the Hedgehog was being used regularly, and the kill rate was bearing out the mathematics. The German response to the sudden increase in their losses was predictably a technical investigation. The Germans were excellent engineers, and they understood that something had changed. What baffled them, what produced the witchcraft assessment, was that the pattern of kills no longer followed the acoustic signature that experienced U-boat commanders had learned to evade. A depth charge attack had a characteristic ASDIC profile. The escorting vessel would lose contact, cross the estimated submarine position, and the explosion would come from behind. There was a known window of approximately 90 seconds, during which an experienced crew could alter depth and course to reduce exposure. With the Hedgehog, there was no window. There was no crossing. There was no loss of contact. From the U-boat's perspective, there was simply a moment at which the ocean above them went dark, and then the projectiles arrived. Several captured German commanders interrogated between 1943 and 1944 reported that their crews had begun to believe that British ships possessed some form of detection technology that could see through the hull of a submerged vessel in real time. One commander stated that his crew had discussed the possibility that the British were using some form of aerial reconnaissance invisible to the naked eye. They were not entirely wrong, of course. Allied aircraft coverage was improving dramatically during this period. But the particular kills attributed to the Hedgehog were occurring in weather conditions that precluded effective aerial search. The explanation that the British had simply engineered their way around the ASDIC dead zone did not apparently occur to the German intelligence analysts as readily as more exotic hypotheses. Comparing the Hedgehog to its German equivalent reveals something interesting about the divergence in technical philosophy between the two navies. Germany had developed its own forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon, the Hedgehog's direct counterpart called the Fliegerabwehrkanon 40. But the more relevant comparison is with the WOs, the German depth charge system, which remained the Kriegsmarine's primary anti-submarine weapon throughout most of the war. German depth charges were, by most engineering assessments, technically comparable to British equivalents. They suffered from exactly the same ASDIC dead zone problem. German surface warfare doctrine, with its emphasis on aggressive torpedo attack rather than convoy escort, had never prioritized the development of a solution to this problem because Kriegsmarine surface commanders expected to be doing the attacking, not the defending. The American equivalent, which emerged somewhat later, was a weapon called the mousetrap, essentially. A version of the Hedgehog adapted for smaller vessels with a reduced firing arc. American engineers had access to the Hedgehog specifications from early 1942 onwards, and acknowledged the British design superiority in terms of pattern consistency, particularly in rough sea states. The mousetrap was explicitly described in U.S. Navy documentation of the period as a simplified adaptation. While it served usefully in coastal and Caribbean anti-submarine operations, it was never credited with the concentrated kill rate that the Hedgehog achieved in the mid-Atlantic. The question of the Hedgehog's actual impact on the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic is one that historians have debated with considerable care, because the spring of 1943 saw so many anti-submarine improvements arrive simultaneously. Long-range Liberator aircraft closing the Atlantic Gap, improved signals intelligence from Bletchley Park, better convoy routing, the development of support groups. Attributing individual weight to any single factor is genuinely difficult. What can be said is that May 1943 saw a collapse in U-boat effectiveness so dramatic and sudden that Dönitz temporarily withdrew his wolf packs from the North Atlantic altogether. In that month alone, the Allies sank 41 U-boat. May 1943 is known in German naval history as Schwarzer Mai Black May. The Hedgehog cannot claim sole credit for Black May, but it can claim a share of it that the statistics do not permit us to dismiss. What is less debated is the Hedgehog's influence on subsequent weapons development. The principle it established, the contact-fused, forward-thrown, multi-projectile salvo, became the basis for the Squid, a three-barreled mortar introduced in 1943 that threw a pattern of full-size depth charges ahead of the ship with stabilized aiming and a genuinely lethal probability per attack approaching 60%. The Squid is widely considered one of the most effective anti-submarine weapons of the entire war, and it would not have existed without the Hedgehog demonstrating the concept's validity. The lineage extends forward still further. The principles of contact fusing, forward projection, and salvo timing that the DMWD developed in 1941 and 1942 remain legible in modern naval anti-submarine systems. A small number of Hedgehog arrays survive in museum collections. HMS Belfast, moored on the Thames in London, carries one of the more accessible examples on her bow, visible to visitors who make the walk to the forward gun deck. The weapon looks, at first glance, almost comically modest. A cluster of steel rods, slightly rusty, arranged in an oval like the spines of some small, bewildered animal. There is nothing about it that communicates violence. The projectiles, when separated from their launcher, look like oversized shell casings from an artillery piece. The spigots themselves are thin, almost delicate. A visitor who did not know what they were looking at might mistake the assembly for some kind of signaling apparatus. That modesty is, in a sense, the point. The Hedgehog's lethality was entirely intellectual. It did not win its battles through greater explosive force, or longer range, or more spectacular technology. It won them by understanding, with precise mathematical clarity, the geometry of the problem it was solving, the shape of the dead zone, the margin of ASDIC error, the psychology of a crew receiving no visible confirmation of success, and then designing an answer to each of those specific problems in sequence. The contact fuse answered the question of kill confirmation. The forward firing answered the question of the dead zone. The simultaneous salvo answered the question of pattern consistency. And the wire that tied those 24 spigots together in a tenth of a second answered the question of whether the system would actually work under combat conditions in freezing water, on a rolling deck, against a target that was already trying to escape. 7 submarines in 48 hours. Dönitz called it witchcraft. It was, in fact, the opposite of witchcraft. It was the result of a small group of engineers at a facility, some of them not strictly speaking engineers at all, sitting down with a specific problem and refusing to accept that the existing answers were good enough. The why was not remarkable. The thinking that designed the system it served was extraordinary.